Good morning and welcome everyone to the 16th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. I once again thank the Broadcasting Office for their work helping organise this meeting, and I ask everyone to ensure their mobile phones are in silent. Today's main business will be an evidence session on third sector and COVID-19. But first, at item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is consideration of evidence heard at today's meeting, and agenda item 4 is consideration of our work programme. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume your consent. Does anyone object? In that case, that is agreed. Thank you. Items 3 and 4 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on the third sector and COVID-19. Our discussion today will look at how the Scottish Government is supporting the third sector with its Third Sector Resilience Fund. I'm pleased to welcome our first panel of witnesses, Anna Fowley, Chief Executive, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, Sire Lockhart, Chief Executive, First Port. I'm grateful to you for both for taking time to answer our questions today and also for your joint written submission. Allocated just under an hour for this session, and we have a number of issues to discuss with you. So to fellow committee members, please, where possible, address your questions to the witnesses by name to help broadcasting staff turn on the right microphones. If you don't do so, I will call witnesses by name in turn to answer their question. I also ask witnesses and members to please give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. If a witness feels a question is not for them but perhaps for another panellist, then please say so. Thank you. And I will now move on to questions. The first question being, how closely do the witnesses feel their organisations worked with the Scottish Government in the design of the fund? And are they aware that if the wider third sector was consulted during the design stage? Anna?
Okay. So are we talking specifically about the Third Sector Resilience Fund?
Well, yes, but you can widen it out. Yes, right.
So we were consulted at the very start as SCVO about the funding, all of the funding that was going to be made available by Scottish Government. And we are a membership organisation, so obviously we're in touch with what our members think. So I feel we were quite closely involved in the original design of the funds. And particularly in the Wellbeing Fund, and to a lesser extent in the Third Sector Resilience Fund, and a lesser extent again in the Supporting Communities Fund.
Okay, thank you. Josiah, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, I'm speaking specifically about the Third Sector Resilience Fund. There was a necessity in the speed of getting the fund out to do a quick consultation, and it probably wasn't as deep as some of the other funds were. We consulted both with Scottish Government directly, the three partners, Cora Foundation, First Port and Social Investment Scotland, along with SCVO, and we did a very fast consultation with intermediaries, membership bodies representing community anchor organisations, social enterprise and the voluntary sector more broadly.
Okay, can I ask do you think that the wider sector was involved fully or enough in terms of the design of the fund?
Of the Third Sector Resilience Fund, I think there could have been an opportunity to do more, but there was a balance between the necessity of getting funds out in speed. Third Sector Resilience Fund in particular was to address organisations at high risk immediately due to the lockdown. And the fund, I think, was launched 2 days following lockdown. So the speed of getting it out, there was a balance to be struck between getting money out fast and a wider response. The other funds, however, which were focused on community response directly, did a much broader and deeper response because that was addressing the needs of communities specifically.
Yeah, so it was time more than anything else that impacted on the lack of information. Thank you very much for that. Anna, do you have any comment to make on the wider groupings?
Yeah, I think you have to bear in mind that the sector is huge. So it's 40,000 different organisations. you'd be hard pressed to consult even a small number of those. So I think that that's where exactly what Josiah said, the role of intermediary organisations, of which we are one example, but there are many others, was really important. And that was we did a lot of consultation via intermediaries as well, rather than directly, because it's almost an impossible task. And it was an immediate response. Even the Wellbeing Fund and the others, it might not have been immediate, but it was still a lot quicker than most funding is launched. So, and the impetus really was to get money where it was needed most as quickly as possible.
Okay, that's great. Listen, I've got a question less about the fund, but more about the future of the sector. In the report of the Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, just published on Monday, the group recommended the Scottish Government should take action to protect the capacity, financial sustainability of the third sector. Do any of you have any suggestions on how the government should do this over the medium term?
Yeah, so I would really welcome that report, and it also echoed the report that the Scottish Parliament's Equalities and Human Rights Committee published last year, which said very similar things. It's really important that we recognise that while a lot of the sector has been very involved in the immediate response to the virus, there's also a whole swathe of the sector which needs to be ready for recovery and needs to be able to support really all of Scotland to recover from the virus. And it's really important that those organisations are there when we emerge from this. And you need to also bear in mind what you all know already, that the sector was already in a very financially precarious position, which is what was identified by the committee's findings. And you know, people have been going on about this for quite a long time, but this situation has exacerbated that. So it's really important that we look as Scotland as a whole. It's not just the role of government to do this. We all, as a whole, need to look at how we can protect the sector and make sure that it's fit for purpose for the future.
Yeah, thank you for that. Josiah, just on that point, do you think there's been an opportunity through this to see if there's new ways of the third sector working with the organisations such as local government and government and national government after when we're coming out of the pandemic?
Yes, I do. I think there's a lot of new ways that have emerged through this. Partnership in particular has been one thing that's been at the forefront of all of this, communities as well as medium-sized and larger third sector organisations coming together to do things and working quite closely with local government to do responses. A lot of the information we're getting, reading through the detail of the applications and also the wider responses to some of the inquiries that have been happened across the Scottish economy over the past few weeks. There's a lot of things about procurement, how local governments work closely with third sector organisations around procurement in particular, and help facilitate ways of helping organisations be creative about how they can work in partnership. I think we've learned a lot through this time, and new models of doing both business and charity have been emerging, and right now is a good time to invest together. And I think local government has a lot of tools and vehicles they could use to help enable that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you both. Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning. It's good to see everybody. I'd like to ask for some reflections, both from Anna and Josiah. Maybe Anna first and then Josiah. And the first question is really about the fact that Oscar, our charities organisation, said that 20% of our charities were facing a critical threat. So it was to ask about what you think about the level of the fund and the analysis of the payments thus far, to what extent it's been able to support those organisations. And then I was going to ask Josiah about lessons for improvement. So Anna, can I ask you that first question about the level of the fund and how it's actually helped or not in terms of those charitable organisations?
Yeah, so certainly the Resilience Fund was very much focused, as Josiah said, on immediate threat to viability, and that was immediate. And obviously people's viability, organisations' viability has changed and generally deteriorated over the past few weeks, particularly as independent fundraising and the ability to generate unrestricted income has really been impacted by lockdown. So that's hugely important. The other funds have been about supporting the activities that have been going on, and again have been very focused on the activities to address the immediate situation. And what we're looking for now is some sort of transition funding or some process to enable organisations to fundraise themselves to address that medium to long-term sustainability. Because I think I said at the start as well that particularly, Sarah, that the sector is really precarious anyway, and a lot of organisations, especially the wee local ones, who are really, really important in all of this, are very dependent on short-term, immediate bursts, either grants or fundraising activity. So I'm really worried about the viability of a lot of organisations across the sector, large and small.
Thanks. I mean, one of the things that comes out in the feedback we've had is that at the very local level or in very rural areas, charities did feel very vulnerable. Are there lessons that need to be applied to potential future funding from the Scottish Government and the capacity to do fundraising that maybe needs to be ramped up?
Yeah, I think I suppose it's a perverse benefit of all of this is identified the real crucial importance of those small local organisations in supporting their own communities and their community activities. And I think that one of the things that our members have identified consistently over the years has been the hits to local government funding and the impact that then has, because that's a far bigger funding source for the sector than Scottish Government funding has been. And it's really important that those local connections are maintained, and that ability for local government to fund its local community services is absolutely vital.
That's really helpful. I will come back to that as a future question, I think. Colleagues know me. If convener, I can ask Josiah that second question about the lessons learned from the first and the second stage of the fund. It was about that localisation and access to the fund and issues about how you do reach those in need, and what changes have been made between phase 1 and 2, and what impact would you say they have had? Because we did receive some criticism from some of those who hadn't been able to access funding or had looked at why people couldn't get access. Have you any comments about changes and why they were needed?
The primary reasons for changes between phases 1 and phase 2 were the result of other funds from both the Scottish Government and the UK Government and programmes coming online. Third Sector Resilience Fund was about 3 or 4 weeks ahead of the other ones. Some of the lessons for improvement that could have come from that is probably closer working between the variety of funds that were out there, both the third sector ones and the ones outside of that. And I do know that some of the work going on around recovery is trying to bring those conversations together a bit more specifically. One of the other big, large things that became apparent, and is actually in the responses you received in some of the TSI report that came out yesterday, was questions around the skills of some of the organizations that didn't understand some of what they call business language when they get in there. And when they're saying that, they're referring to phrases like cash flow and reserves and stuff like that, which is a concern, particularly at this time, because those are the things that will cause those organizations to fall if they do fall in the coming months. So further support in anything that comes in the future around how to help those organizations understand and plan what those things mean. It is a slightly worrying thing looking at the financial position of a lot of the third sector coming into this move forward. I also think closer working with groups outside of Scottish Government oriented funds is imperative. Looking at triggers of what caused a lot of organizations to need resiliency funding. A lot of it is either stuff that is not the wider independent grant sector. Independent grant makers have been very good at diversifying and unrestricting their income, but organizations who relied locally on individual donations from people, or those that relied on some sort of trading element, trading in particular, were major triggers as cash flow started to decrease across that. So lessons for improvement would really be about joining up the funds to be able to speak and reach into pockets of the sector and join up both delivery that's new and ongoing support, as well as helping those organizations plan to get in.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible. I mean, how will that actually happen? That we had some comments from TSI groups about that need for knowledge, and how does that get disseminated in a world where people can't turn up to conferences and everything's got to be online? How could that be done over the next couple of months to ensure that those organisations that are vital are still resilient and still in place come the end of the summer?
I think speed of getting that out and making it more agile to be able to speak. I mean, we are in a world where just about everything now has to be delivered digitally. So understanding elements of digital inclusion, particularly with the Third Sector Resilience Fund, we're starting to, as it's continuing in some form for the next couple of weeks, at least until recovery. We switched to recovery. We're working in digital inclusion, both for disabled individuals and people from ethnic minority groups to be able to access that support better. We also will have the ability to tie into things like Just Enterprise for the enterprising third sector and the TSI networks to help deliver some of that support as we move into some sort of recovery phase. I can't speak too much about what that will look like because I know those consultations are going on with stakeholders from across the 4 funds that have been in place. But my hope is that we'll be able to have that support to plan for resiliency and recovery at the same time as proper investment into those organizations.
Thank you. Anna, do I have time to ask Anna for a quick supplementary on that same question, or is it next person?
To be very quick, and the answer would have to be very quick as well.
Just that feedback on any additional views you've got, Anna, over that resilience over the next couple of months. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that Josiah is correct that we need to have a lot more alignment over the different funding and also to work really closely with the independent funders. We have trusts and foundations in Scotland who are really keen to help, and that's one of the things that both Josiah and I have been involved in, really hopeful and good conversations about a more collective and more collaborative approach to funders, so that independent funders are willing to collaborate together to identify need, to make sure that they don't duplicate, but they each maybe deal with a different gap. So I think that's a source of hope for the future, because I think speed was of the essence as it is at this moment, and so everybody tried to do something with great intentions, but actually now we really need to have much more alignment and for it to be a more strategic approach.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Graham?
Thanks, convener. Good morning, both of you. I just wonder if you can just quickly explain what each of your organisations does, because we've not actually heard that yet. We'll start with Josiah, because I think First Port sounds like it deals with shipping containers rather than the charity sector. So Josiah, you go first.
Hi, Graham. Thank you for the question. So First Port formal name is First Port for Social Entrepreneurs. So we are the kind of main entry point for social enterprises and kind of community enterprises wanting to start and set up and start to develop their organization. So we work with business support across the enterprising third sector, as well as run a number of grant programs for developing those. We worked with the Resilience Fund, with Cora Foundation, with a more charity and communities approach, and Social Investment Scotland, who can deal with a lot more of the larger organizations to do that.
Great. Anna?
Yeah, so SCVO is a membership organisation. We've got over 2,000 members across the voluntary sector, which is not just charities, it's community groups and other organisations as well. So we provide services to members and we are the voice of our members, but we are also funded to be the voice of the whole sector, which is a challenge, and we can't claim to do that perfectly. But that's 40,000 organisations across Scotland, 24,000 of which are charities. So we try to lobby on behalf of the sector to influence, but we also deliver services.
Okay, thanks for that. I think that was very useful. So going on that 40,000 figures, there's 40,000 organisations out there, and according to figures that we've got, by the start of May, and I realise that's quite a long way back, there were just over 2,300 applications to these various funds. which I reckon is about 5% of those 40,000 organisations. That's to me, that's quite a low figure. Are they all aware of the funds that they can apply for? We'll start with Anna.
I think we've done a lot of work. Government and SCVO and many others, PSIs particularly, have done a lot of work to promote the fact the funding's available. To local government has as well, indeed. And Scottish Government policy areas as well have done a lot of work to promote the funding. Inevitably, you'll never reach everybody, but I think we've all collectively tried to use all our channels to do that as much as we possibly can. We've done a lot of work through Third Force News, our magazine and online news service, which reaches a huge audience as well. So I'm sure that could be better, but I suppose what you need to remember, that 40,000 could be a wee playgroup somewhere, and it could be the British Heart Foundation. So you're talking about such different organisations that reaching them, and again using those intermediaries as well to reach all those organisations. I think all I can say is we've tried our best collectively.
Saya, anything on that one?
I would agree with everything Anna said, that been trying to get these out as far and wide as we can. Just to update some of those figures for you, there were, as of last Friday, just over 3,000, almost 3,200 applications that came in. Now, for the Resilience Fund, now that's not that many organizations, because there were a number of multiple applications from the same organization over that process. But I think the other thing to recognize that each of the funds individually have a specific purpose, so not everybody needed a fund for that specific reason. I think what research we need to do going forward, particularly over the next year, is to try to dissect who accessed which fund for what reason, and where gaps are emerging as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there's too many funds? I mean, do you think it's all a bit too confusing for people? Josiah.
I mean, a lot of feedback, particularly as they were not just the third sector funds, but the wider Scottish Government and UK government funds. None of them came along at the same time. So I think there is a lot of feedback that there was people were almost over given information to do that. But I think that's where that argument that both Anna and I were making, Boyack, was that in what we do going forward, some sort of consolidation, or at least working and much closer together, is what needs to be done going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, Anna, you mentioned the wee local organisations, and they're going to really struggle to deal with the bureaucracy of all this, are they not?
Well, we've tried to make it as minimal bureaucracy as we can, and you have to balance up bureaucracy and due diligence, because you can't. I mean, I do think that some funders probably took more risks than they would naturally have done in the past, just to get money out of the door, and presumably there will, it'll come to light that some mistakes were made in there, but I don't think so, and that's a real learning for us. I think we have tried to make it as unbureaucratic as possible, while preserving due diligence. It's really important that we make sure that that the organisations receiving the money can actually use it to best effect. So I do think that's really important. And on the kind of plethora of funding, I think it's one thing having different funding behind the scenes and for it coming from different policy areas within government or having different responsibilities. But for the applicants, they don't need to know that. They just need to be able to apply for funding. And if we have to do something behind the scenes to make sure it gets allocated to the right cost centre, and I say we, that could be anyone involved in this, then that's not a matter for them. That's a matter that the behind the scenes can take care of. The applicants should be able to just go in and say, this is the amount we need, this is what it's for, and expect that to be assessed.
And is it that simple?
It could be that simple. It certainly isn't at the moment.
But is it that simple?
Just now?
Yes.
No, because there's different funds that people have to, as Josiah said, people apply to different funds. Some people apply to multiple funds. Some people don't have folk with the skills to fill in funding applications. And that's why we would like to see, both Josiah and I would like to see the front face of it simplified, even if the back end has to be complicated.
Right. Okay. That's really useful. So at the moment, it is too complicated. Sorry, James.
Don't your time up.
My time's up. You'll be pleased to know.
Okay. Thank you very much, Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues, and to our panel. I've got two sets of questions. I'll just crack on so that I hopefully manage to do still within my time. The first question I have is actually how much is, in total, was available to the fund. I had thought there was an initial 20 million for grants, 5 million for loans, and then there was a top up of 5 million around April. Can we just get clarity what the fund actually comprises?
Just those numbers are correct. There was 20 million initially put into the fund, along with 5 million for loans, and then there was an additional top up of 5 million around the time phase 2.
Thank you. So it's 30 million fund we're talking about. How much is left? Looking at the figures from SPICE, it seems that there may be some money left, although it's not entirely clear. And of course, the figures change, from each moment in time. But do either of you know how much money is actually left as we speak?
Yes, I can speak to the stats from last Friday. Things are being updated. So as of last Friday, 21.4 million has been issued to organizations themselves through the grants, and 2.5 million have been issued to in loans to 27 organizations. Now, at any given time, there's between 500,000 to 1.5 million in assessment. So we're talking potentially committed is around the 23 million pound mark. So we're getting very, very close to the end, but we're on a weekly conversation with the Scottish Government about how those numbers within assessment are going up and down, because at some point we will have to figure out either to close it or to roll it into whatever recovery ends up happening.
Okay, thanks for that. So it seems there's
Anna wanted to come in.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So just to say that that's specifically around the Third Sector Resilience Fund. So there's also been 50 million in the Wellbeing Fund, 40 million in the Supporting Communities Fund, and 70 million in the Food Fund. So I don't have the exact figures. I don't have a sophisticated tech as Josiah has, but it's, again, I would say it was probably pretty similar. That probably about 2/3 to 3/4 has been allocated, but there's some left that we hope to get out over the next few weeks. But that's a matter for government.
Thanks for that. So there's still some money left, and it depends what happens over the next few weeks. And I guess the request would be that if it's not spent in terms of the current provision, that it would be rolled over for future provision, I would imagine. In terms of the loans, what are the repayment terms, broadly speaking, in terms of the time within which loans must be repaid? And either can answer, Anna or Josiah.
I'm probably best suited to answer that question. They are extremely generous, so more generous than it's 0% interest over 3 years with a repayment holiday on the front end. So extremely generous for what they are.
Yes, indeed, very generous. I'm sure many of us would appreciate loans on that basis. But that gives you an idea as well as to the whole picture. Turning to the other area of questions in the time left, and perhaps starting with Anna, I noted in the joint submission the look at the future and the proposition that more money would be needed for recovery, but also there was a statement to the effect that this additional funding should not be to meet resilience, but rather to include, or not meet resilience simply, but rather to include recovery and new service design and delivery. So 2 points there. One, in terms of fundraising, I just wonder what activity is now underway as we speak to look at that again in the new normal and cascade that down as quickly as possible to individual member bodies so that they can crack on with that. And secondly, one feature I think of this process has been actually that the focus has been on delivery and not bureaucracy, that there has been flexibility and not red tape, and that this has had a much better outcome. So looking to the future, are these some of the kind of points that you would be considering in the new design and delivery mechanism?
Yes, absolutely. So on the first point about fundraising, Institute of Fundraising particularly are doing quite a lot of work on this, and we're obviously hooked in with them. And we have seen actually sort of more online fundraising, as you've seen, which is great, particularly for the bigger organisations and things like the Kilt Walk or replacement for the marathon and stuff like that. But that's when you've got big organisations with marketing companies and all that. Smaller community organisations are reliant on physical community action, so being able to do things in their local community that generates income, and that's really dependent on coming out of lockdown. So it's all very much, I'm sure that a lot of community organisations will have welcomed the First Minister's announcement yesterday, but that is, obviously there's no clarity on that. Rightly there's no clarity because we don't know what's going to happen with the virus, but that it's those kind of things that make it really difficult for small local organisations. And in terms of the flexibility and the sort of new service design, I think a lot of voluntary sector organisations have found that they can do things differently, that they can do things more online, though obviously that's not ideal for a lot of things. But they need a wee bit of investment to be able to achieve that, and they're doing that. But we would like to see some sort of transition support for them to do that. But the focus on delivery that you mentioned is probably the most important thing, so that we have seen a real agility. I don't particularly like the word, but actually it has been around from funders, whether it's public sector or independent funders, around what you can use your money for, and with more trust and less kind of emphasis on reporting and monitoring. And I think that's something we would really like to see continue.
Well, I think that's very encouraging to hear, Anna. I would just say in terms of fundraising ideas and innovation, I think a young girl, a primary school girl in my constituency, Maisie Fotheringham, raised I think about £1,800 for the Benarty Food Bank by painting rainbow painting. So, there's lots of desire out there, and I think lots of really good ideas. So it doesn't need to be as bleak as some people paint it, because there's also a lot of desire on the part of the public to support.
Absolutely. One thing, can I just add one thing on that? We've seen quite a lot of public support going into funding for the NHS, and that has actually been to the detriment of some local organisations and some charities. So some of the messaging it's really important, of course, but we would like to see people remembering that their local community organisations need that funding.
Okay, thanks for that, Anna, but I can't really see a campaign saying don't support your NHS coming up anytime soon. I know that's not what you're suggesting. Okay, Andy.
Thanks very much, Convener. Welcome, both of you today. Josiah mentioned the Third Sector Interface report yesterday, and I noticed from that 36, but there was 1,171 respondents to that survey, and of those, 36% of organisations felt that their financial position is likely to worsen, and this will cause us challenges. But only 16% of organisations had actually received any funding through the Third Sector Resilience Fund. Do you have any sense of the scale and the nature of the financial challenges facing the sector over the next 2 years or so? Or are we too early to assess that? Maybe start with Anna.
I think
Oh, it's me, right, okay. We don't have an exact sense of that. I think we've got reports from Oscar, we've got stuff that we've got in from intermediary organisations, our own surveys, and they all suggest we're looking at 20 to 50% in really, really difficult circumstances, and I think everybody will have challenges, but we don't. It's definitely not a time for robust figures. We're all working on that, but we don't have that quite yet. But we know that I don't know that there's anyone who's going to be in a comfortable position.
Josiah, do you have anything to add to that or not?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is that looking at the data within the financial data coming through the third sector resilience funds, we're likely to see a multi-sector approach, so a 5 or 6 or even 7 speed recovery. So certain subsectors within the third sector will recover differently. Arts right now are talking about delaying even a year. Those affected by tourism are starting to delay, and a lot of organizations whose income, whose trading income is based upon either tourism or residual effects of tourism, having more bodies here, have lost 50% of the height of their season, so are likely to recover slower than other ones who might be, for instance, health and social care will come back a little bit faster. But I think that's a big thing to recognize, is that we can't see clearly what that is, but even with the data we have, it's going to be a multi-speed recovery depending on where people sit.
And Anna, you said in response to an earlier question, the need for a more strategic approach in future. I'm just wondering if there are lessons that we've already learned about the role of the third sector vis-a-vis local government, for example, but also in terms of how it relates to itself, duplication of services, the need for more resilience, more working together, efficiencies. I mean, are there any lessons about how the sector is structured and goes about its business, which might have been perfectly sustainable in, as it were, normal times, but won't be going forward?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of lessons. And one of the things we've seen is that organisations working together who wouldn't necessarily have worked together before, and that's really powerful, including at a local level with local authorities. And we've seen that it's obviously very different across the country, and it's very different across the sector. So because it is so diverse, there's lots of different ways that the sector is structured, and lots of different ways that that organisations are constituted. But I think this is a real opportunity to open that up and to say, how can we do things differently? The sector is being recognised, probably for the first time, as something that's really important in things like tourism, as Josiah has mentioned. So how can we make sure that the sector is fit for purpose? But that's a different thing in all different areas. So absolutely, I think this is a time to look at changes, to look at where there's duplication, to look at where there's some things that have emerged, because a lot of new things have emerged over the last few weeks that we hadn't seen before. So how do we build on that? How do we make sure it's a 21st century sector that's attractive to young people, where young people understand how the Byzantine governance that is around works? And how can we really build on that? I think it is absolutely the right time to be doing that.
Thank you very much. We've had some concern and criticism that the way funding has been distributed has been over centralised and not responsive enough to local circumstances. Do you think those criticisms are valid?
I understand where it's coming from, but I don't think so. I think that we have worked really closely, and certainly with the Wellbeing Fund, with the local third sector interfaces, who've been able to input their local knowledge, and that's been absolutely crucial to how that money has been allocated across communities. So I think we have engaged really well certainly around that fund. I'm less knowledgeable on the other funds. Josiah might want to comment on that.
On the third sector resilience fund specifically, I mean, like with Anna, I understand concerns from communities who ask these questions. Third sector resilience fund, which was probably the most central in its delivery, was largely because it was focused on cash flow recovery as opposed to the direct community need. But looking at the data of what's been coming through, so taking that critique and trying to apply it to ourselves, nearly every local authority has same success rates across what it's doing. Nearly every sector has same success rates across what it's doing. So despite having been done somewhat centrally, the data coming through success rates and money and amount of awards going into communities is almost balanced across the whole of Scotland. And that can be seen looking at the information that's been published both by us and the Scottish Government to date.
Okay, thank you. And in your joint submission, you very helpfully in Appendix C gave us a breakdown of applications by sector and beneficiary location. I'm just wondering if there's any other analysis that you have or could do about the nature of the communities that these organisations serve, urban, rural classifications, extent of deprivation. Have you captured any of that data?
It has been captured just now, and it's been allocated. It's been analysed in terms of the Wellbeing Fund, and that's something that we're really keen to see. We haven't got it all extracted yet, but what we want to do is to be able to identify where there's been cold spots, where perhaps communities have been missed or communities of interest have been missed. But at the moment, it looks like it's been, as Josiah said, quite kind of diverse and crossing lots of things. But our data is not as advanced as Josiah's data. We're getting there.
These are all things that we're trying to dig into, going back through time, and we're working quite closely with the data science team within the Scottish Government, who we're actively passing data once a week to analyse some of these deeper questions. So if there's anything specifically the committee wants to know, please pass those inquiries to me, and I can work closely with that team to find those out for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy?
Good morning, convener, and thank you again to the panel. I think a lot of the issues have been dealt with by my colleagues already. I suppose, just looking forward, clearly we're going to go into quite a difficult time economically. From your kind of experience, who do you think is going to have the biggest struggle? Is it going to be the medium-sized charity or the small local charity? I mean, presumably the larger charities, as you've said previously, have a better infrastructure, a larger infrastructure that can maybe get them through the next 12, 18 months. But is it the small charity, the local charity, or the medium-sized charity that you think is going to come under most pressure? And I'm happy to start with Josiah.
This is a question that we get asked frequently. I'm not sure that size dictates stability through time, particularly over the next period, because it's less even about reserves and more about cash flow and how they can meet the needs today as they move through. Larger organizations may have an infrastructure to be able to come up with plans in a faster way, but the ability to access support and investment, whether that's grants or in any other way or donations, becomes difficult. What the data from the Resilience Fund has been showing us is the two main things that dictate your stability this period is your reliance on individual donations, as in from people or corporate donations, so not grants, and also your element of trading and how much you rely on trading. In a slightly perverse way, the thing we've been encouraging people to do about diversifying their income and developing trading and everything, the organizations that have done that over the past few years have been the least resilient to the crisis that we're facing. Whereas those who are working with very helpful funders who have been making it unrestricted are the ones who, at least in the short term, have been more stable. So in my perspective, at least from the Resilience Fund data, it shows that those two ends, high reliance on trading and high reliance on individual donations, are the organizations that are most at risk.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I suppose my next question is maybe for Anna. I mean, you've talked, and Josh has, and others have talked about doing it differently within the sector, with an openness within the sector. I mean, I suppose the question for me is, there are lots of charities out there. You represent lots of individuals. Is this an opportunity to see charities coming together, but actually formally merging? And do you think there's an appetite within the sector for that, to be able to see the bigger picture and for maybe charities actually to come together in a formal way rather than more informally?
I think there is an opportunity for them to consider that. I think it's something that the organisations themselves have to make a choice on and make a call on. I wouldn't like to see that imposed on them by funders, public funders or others. I think it's up to the sector itself and the organisations in it to work that out. But I think there's also a difference between merger and collaboration. So we've definitely seen more collaboration. And the talk about mergers is really interesting. It's happened in many organisations already. We've seen Simon Community and Streetworks, for example, come together really successfully in a merger, and that's worked. But that's a kind of approach that applies in the larger organisations, or maybe the ones that are contracted and procured. It's probably less of an issue for the small community organisations, the sports clubs, the youth work organisations, where they are providing a specific thing for their specific area, but they're not a large turnover organisation with big backroom overheads, for example. So I think it's horses for courses.
Sorry, do you have a comment on that?
Not much to add to Anna's, but I would, as I stressed earlier about the importance of helping organizations go through planning support, I think that mergers in all of its guises, there are many different ways to do that, needs to be an option for them, and organizations, it can be quite complicated in certain circumstances, should be supported to do that where necessary. Personally, I think saving services and jobs, services for communities and people, and the people who do them is probably a priority for us. So the best way to do that may be a merger in certain circumstances, but it definitely won't be in all, and we can't force anybody to do that.
Okay, and my final question to both of you is, I mean, obviously within the constraints of where we are financially and socially, what is the one ask you would have of Scottish Government and local authorities now? If you had your magic wand, I mean, obviously, you know, we wouldn't be where we are if we did that, but within the confines of reality, what is the magic wand that you would ask your Scottish Government or local authorities?
So I would say it would be to take a longer term view. And I would have said that before coronavirus. It's just becoming to sharper relief now that we really need to look at sustainability and much less short-termism, and a recognition of the role that the sector plays in our society, in our communities, as a vital contribution, not just a kind of add-on, and that it's something that needs to be looked at on a longer term basis, not funded on a year to year or having to rely on kind of, I don't know, really short term projects. It's something that needs to be looked at systemically and seen as part of the overall ecosystem.
And for me, it would simply be flexibility and a joined up approach. So trying to get departments from across Scottish Government and funders, so whether that's the tourism or health and social care or things outside third sector and communities, engaging with this space as well, and ensuring that there's flexibility in whatever that support looks like in the way we work with organizations, because undoubtedly over the next 12 to 18 months, plans will evolve on a weekly or monthly basis as recovery changes.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Kenneth?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Anna, you've just said that it's important that we take a long-term view, but it seems to me that organisations that have taken a long-term view have been penalised, because if they had reserves over 4 months, subsequently amended to 12 weeks, which I understand is what's recommended anyway, then they were penalised in that they weren't able to secure a grant. So how is that looking to the longer term?
So I don't regard it as being penalised, and that only is the situation in regards to the Third Sector Resilience Fund. All the other funding looks from a different lens. It was Josiah's better to talk about the Resilience Fund, but that was to rescue people who were in immediate danger. And And as I said at the start, that is changing. Organisations that felt more secure at the beginning of this are no longer secure, so might actually meet the criteria. But that's why we're looking at different criteria, and this is very much set by government. We can influence that and speak with them about it, but we have to then implement what ministers decide. But I wouldn't regard organisations who don't have substantial reserves as necessarily that's just their business model. Some of them have been really successful over decades without reserves, just because of the way the funding of the sector works, and they've learned how to navigate that. It's not ideal, but they have learned how to navigate it. It's not really a sign of an organisation's robustness or not often. So the criteria are set by government, and we do influence that. But the immediate need was to help out organisations that were really struggling at that point.
Okay. In terms of thinking of the third sector resilience fund, Josiah, Andy touched on the issue of variance, and I want to just expand on that a wee bit. I've been looking at some of the figures. Inverclyde had only 4 grants awarded in Edinburgh, 54. Edinburgh, of course, is very prosperous. Inverclyde is not prosperous, so per capita that's at least twice as much. But when we look at it, we also saw a huge number of rejections in Edinburgh. So, for example, total applications in Inverclyde were only 7, and in Edinburgh 145. Edinburgh, of course, is where many of the national organisations are based, so we would expect the capital to benefit further. So what's been done really to try and go out and elicit applications from areas where we know that there's higher levels of deprivation, because it may be that there's capacity issues in terms of submitting some of these applications to ensure that we do have the fair geographic spread that I think all of us would want to see.
Is a couple different ways to answer that question. I mean, first looking at the data which I've got here next to me around local authorities, in particular, the success rate, so measuring success rate applications versus rejections, is largely balanced across every local authority area. So it's between 35 and about 45%, regardless of the only outliers being those where there's very, very small data sets, Western Isles or Inverclyde. Within that. So as you would expect, large geographic areas have both higher awards and higher rejections than others. As far as targeting specific communities as we can, there's a couple things we've done through the course of the Resilience Fund to try to get those into as many places as possible. In addition to the general blanket working with intermediaries to get information out using social media and kind of speaking to their communities, we've been weekly giving insights out to a variety of intermediaries, including TSIs, and that list has grown as the fund has gone on getting those. So we've been giving live data and information around what's working, what isn't working, where their gaps are on a weekly basis to those areas. So trying to spread information as far and wide as possible. To me, it's interested, I can send those updates back through time to you to see how they were given out. But it's this balance, as Anna said, the sector is very, very broad, so trying to dig in. So in addition to that, we've been doing very specific, whenever questions came in about specific subsectors, so things like community learning or youth work or certain communities specifically, because the Resilience Fund has a really big data set and we're able to work it, we've been able to respond and look into that on an as-needed basis, address certain needs when they've arisen.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. And across the sectors, is there any that I mean, we're talking earlier on about arts, for example. Are there any sectors where you really do fear for the viability and where additional funding should be specifically targeted?
From my perspective, I think it's still too early to name specific sectors that need something in addition to. I think for the time being, I would probably argue for not excluding any sector or prioritizing any yet until we can see what emerges. There are some specific that we have questions about just from the data on the Resilience Fund, and ones that seem to be coming in more often for risk, where their plans seem to not be as resilient. And again, that's probably any organization that relies on the influx of visitors to Scotland, either directly or indirectly. So tourism, halls, particularly in rural communities where there's kind of museums and community facilities and things like that. So The other would be anything that relies on a group of people being in the same place at the same time. And again, community centers is an obvious example of that. The same thing with co-working spaces or arts facilities. But because we don't yet know or have sight of what the releasing of lockdown is going to be and what is actually possible, I would probably argue not yet choose additional measures until we can identify where the needs are. But we should be able to be agile enough to respond to them as they emerge.
Okay, and just my final question, convener. Maddie Halliday, who'll be giving evidence soon, the Chief Executive of Voluntary Action North Lanarkshire, has said, and I quote, talking about the Resilience Fund, that the fund is insufficient by a very long way. Do the panellists agree with that? If so, why? If not, why not? And if they do believe it's insufficient, how much should it be increased to? Josiah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think if it was seen in isolation, it probably would be insufficient. And I also believe it would be insufficient only in that it was a short-term fund. If there was no look at recovery or things like the Wellbeing and Communities Fund, I think that criticism is extremely valid. And I think what we need to decide as a community, all of us across the third sector, is how we build that recovery. Because those insufficiencies are down to that long-term question that we're all talking about. So if we can begin focusing and building on what that looks like between now and 12 to 18 months from now, that's how we can address any of those insufficiencies that comes up.
Okay, Anna?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think that there was never going to be enough money, and I'm sure if you spoke to small business, if you spoke to I don't know, education or whoever, they would all say exactly the same thing. There's the importance. It's really important now to look at that collective effort for the future, so that we can absolutely make sure that there is funding there, but it's not going to come through short-term funding from Scottish Government.
Thank you. Thanks, Camille.
Okay. I have two supplementaries, very brief, if you're going to ask a supplementary here, Andy and Sarah, and brief responses, please, because we are up against the clock. Andy?
Thank you, Convener. I was just to ask, in terms of the Third Sector Resilience Fund, will there be an evaluation of this fund, how the money's been spent and what it's achieved? Will that be, is that planned?
It is planned. In fact, the Scottish Government has already passed to us some of their thoughts on how that should be done. The fund is still ongoing. It hasn't had a deadline since the beginning, so I think it'll be towards the end of that.
Thank you very much.
Sarah?
As a question to Anna Fowley, it's to follow up the point about the huge loss in income from donations and from retail, and our side comment about the NHS. Is it time for a Scottish Government campaign to make us aware of the contribution of the voluntary sector in our communities, just to, we all know what the NHS is doing, but we're not so aware of our third sector? Would that be a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. But I would say, can you join in our campaign that's going on just now, which is #NeverMoreNeeded, which we're do on social media and through various other outlets like Third Force News, where we're really highlighting the stories of where the sector has been never more needed and has absolutely made a huge contribution, because I do think it's actually more visible now than it's ever been before. So we're trying to curate and collate all of that and raise awareness. So I would say join in Never More Needed, but all support for that, wherever it comes from, would be really, really welcome. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. That completes our questions and concludes our evidence session with our first panel. And can I thank you both very much for taking part in this meeting. Okay, we'll have a brief suspension. Back for the second panel. I'm now pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. Leslie Kelly, Chief Officer, Midlothian Third Sector Interface. Maddie Halliday, Chief Executive, Voluntary Action North Lanarkshire, and Hector MacLeod, Chair of Western Isles Third Sector Interface. Thank you all for your submissions, and we have allocated around an hour for this session. And as I said to the first panellist, we have a number of important issues to get through. If you hear another panellist give a very complete answer to a question that you agree with, feel free to simply say that you agree and we can move on to the other issues. Again, for the benefit of broadcasting staff, I'd welcome members saying by name who their questions are addressed to. If they don't do this, I will call the witnesses in order. I also ask witnesses and members to please give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. We'll now move to questions from members as before. And I'd like to know, what impact has COVID-19 had on the local communities represented by yourselves here today? Leslie Kelly, would you mind kicking off?
Yeah, I mean, it's had a huge impact on local communities, obviously, where there was quite a lot of austerity in some of our more disadvantaged communities anyway. So this is obviously built on that. We've seen a lot of isolation. We've seen, which quite surprised us, we've seen a huge demand for hot food in our most disadvantaged areas. And we're trying to establish at the moment if that's a reaction to all the cafes closing, all the healthy eating projects, not being able to go into other people's houses, or whether we've actually uncovered sort of unmet needs there that our community councils have stepped up and led on responding to that. A lot of isolation with people not being able to get out, and in terms of our geography, it is quite isolating because we are a series of market towns. Obviously, public transport being what it is, we're finding it difficult for people to get out and go to places where they would usually have gone for shopping. We also work with a lot of our local advice agencies, working with the most disadvantaged people. And obviously there are certain challenges to providing people with things like benefits advice at the moment, where there's issues with literacy and things like that, where you would usually be sitting next to the client that they're discussing, you know, whatever benefits claim they're trying to make. Obviously all that's trying to be done remotely. And our organisations have really risen to the challenge of delivering services digitally, but it's not quite the same as being able to sit next to somebody and speak to them.
Maddie Holiday.
Well, I support the comments that Leslie's made around the increased number of people relying on food support. We capture data from the organisations providing food support, and in fact the trend gone up week on week, and it's the majority of food support has been for people who can't afford to buy food. The other thing that's gone up significantly is the number of people requesting and receiving remote wellbeing checks and befriending calls, and the sector's responded very rapidly to going from offering face-to-face in-person support to remote support. But that highlights another issue, which is a digital exclusion challenge. So obviously face-to-face support through an audiovisual package like this is much better than phone support, but many people don't have devices. If they have a device, they don't have often sufficient broadband. So that was always a big issue in North Lanarkshire, but it's now become an acute issue. And also the challenge of people who are struggling with income due to loss of income from furlough, redundancy, is growing. And also we need to pay attention to, and it's very well documented across Scotland, but the challenge for people's mental health, but particularly children and young people's mental health, due to the fact that they're not able to undertake their normal activities, meet friends and so on. So these are a cluster of impacts that probably everybody's experiencing, but I would say that it isn't equal. So North Lanarkshire is one of the most deprived areas in Scotland with the fourth largest population. And I think it's important to emphasise that these challenges are far greater in deprived areas where people may not have gardens to go out and take fresh air, and people have less resources, they may have less social support. But what I would say is the, as we call it in North Lanarkshire, the community and voluntary sector has been absolutely amazing in the speed of its response and the scale of its response and its commitment. And I think I just want to emphasise that this has relied on existing staff, existing volunteers, and actually only now are we beginning to find that we need new volunteers. But it's really important to emphasise the role that volunteers have played in this support.
What I'll do, Sarah, do you want to come in with some questions and to the other witnesses at this stage? And I'll go back to Hector.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, happy to do that. And I think the points were very well made about the increasing need for support and the amazing work being done by the third sector and charities in our communities and the role of volunteers. The question I would have, Convener, is about the local experiences of applying for the Third Sector Resilience Fund. We've just heard from the SCVO and the administrators of how it works, but what was your perspective? How would you like to have seen it change? We've seen things like if you had any reserves at all, you were automatically excluded, or if you've changed how you provide your services, you weren't able to get support. What's been the view, Leslie, in the Midlothian context?
That came up for us, and the first, echoing what was said in the previous panel, was about people were very confused what they could and couldn't apply for and which fund was most appropriate to them. And also I think the fund started slightly before furlough, so people were still trying to work out what their business model was going to be for the few months. So I understand entirely that they probably got a few inappropriate applications right at the beginning. But I 100% echo Anna's Fowley's comments about the applicants don't need to know which fund they're applying to. They just need to know that there's a fund that they can apply to for their needs, and then all of that could be sorted out at the back end. So there was quite a lot of confusion, and most of the calls that we got about the funds were people trying to work out which one to apply for, and then needing help to put the budget together for that. And we were obviously very happy to support that. I would also say any criticisms that we're making of the fund, it's with the benefits of hindsight. And we really do want to pay tribute to the fact that funders were so flexible and so good at getting money out of the door in a timely fashion. And I'm sure they worked all the hours that God sent to be able to do that. So we do want it in that context. But that was our one criticism of it. The other criticism is the one that's also been raised about the reserves. We spend a lot of the time as a TSI trying to promote best practice, and obviously trying to build up a minimum of 3 months reserves is absolutely necessary to get you through fluctuations, either in grant funding coming through or dips in trading income or unexpected. I mean, nobody could have anticipated this really, but you know, we do have unexpected weather conditions or things that impact on business models. So we would say 12 months absolute minimum. And all this really did was by putting those kind of artificial barriers there, it just meant that you shoved it further down the line, because people did have to dip into their reserves to be able to fund activity. And obviously those reserves that are used up, they're not being refunded at the moment. It's actually quite difficult for organisations to build up substantial reserves if you're not trading, because grant income is always given for a specific purpose. So trying to build up, reserves from a little bit money here and a little bit money there is difficult. And I think once the demographics of our voluntary organisations is that they're largely grant dependent. We have one of the largest social enterprises in the country in Midlothian. Otherwise, it's mainly grant funded organisations. They will find it very, very difficult to recover reserves from this. So I suppose, that was the two issues for us.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. And Maddie from North Lanarkshire?
In terms of ease of applying, sorry, was that your question, Sarah? I forgot to write it down and I was so engrossed in Leslie's answer.
It was lessons learned and, what was problematic and what's been changed and what would you want to change if we have more funds coming out of the pandemic, really?
I have a very foundational point to make here, which is that it's not just about funding the voluntary sector, but getting funding to their beneficiaries. So if we're really serious about meeting need equitably, we actually need to look at how we allocate resources by local authority population based on deprivation, and we do not do that. We do not do that even with ongoing funding. Look at the way in which third sector interfaces are funded, for example. But with this fund, now I commend the intention of this fund, the Resilience Fund and all the others. I commend the pace at which it was set up. However, third sector interfaces were not consulted properly, were not involved. Now we're the organisations locally, 32 of us, that have local intelligence and local engagement. SCVO has 2,000 members. In North Lanarkshire alone, there's 1,800 voluntary community groups on our database alone. But Oscar, in its recent research they've just published, has indicated that in areas of deprivation, which you've always known, there's actually less social infrastructure and less voluntary groups per head of population, which means, of course, you'll get less applications to these funds, however open it is. I feel very strongly the way funding should be delivered is through local intermediary bodies, and they should be getting a proportionate amount of funding for their population. So I think when you say about lessons learned...
Maddie, this is all very important, but can we sort of shorten our answers because we've got a lot to get through, and poor Sarah is going to get cut off by me until she's not allowed to answer another question.
Okay, but I suppose that's my answer really, is that the approach is fundamentally wrong, that we need to actually be looking at distributing resources in a proportionate way to organisations that know the local sector.
Thank you. Sarah?
Is Hector back on the call with us yet? Be interested in the perspective from the Western Isles.
Hello,
on
good
that
morning.
particular issue about funding. Yes.
Are you there, Hector?
Yes, yeah. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, so my question was about problems with the Resilience Fund in terms of the principles, how it was distributed, and I know there were some comments about rural communities in particular. I'd be very keen to get your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Resilience Fund, as was said earlier on, was the first one to be rolled out, and then we moved on to wellbeing, etc. It has to be said that the Resilience Fund, perhaps due to the timescales involved, there wasn't a lot of information on that particular fund, and it was, as said before, based on sustainability. So, to be honest, as a TSI, that's probably the fund we had least involvement in, but we did have quite a lot of feedback on applications, and we did get involved post-applications, mostly in cases where they were refused. And again, as was said earlier, it was mostly to do with reserves. It seemed to us in some circumstances that organisations and groups who had perhaps prudently built up reserves over a period, which obviously they're obliged to do, were perhaps punished for having that. And that's not to say that the smaller groups shouldn't benefit also, but we had a lot of instances of groups who had resources and restricted funding. In most cases, they seem to have the most difficulty accessing this fund.
Thank you.
Okay, Sarah. Right, thank you. Jeremy?
Thank you, Camilla, and good morning to the panel. I wonder if I can ask, from your experience locally, going forward for the next few months and into next year, what groups are you most concerned about? Is it the small local food bank, the local charity with volunteers, or is it the medium-sized charity that's working in your area? What feedback are you getting? And I'm happy to start with the Western Isles, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think I would probably say that there's concern about all sizes of organisation and all activities. They've all been challenged in different ways. Obviously we're an island group. We cover 4 island groups: Lewis, Harris, Uist and Barra, and there are different circumstances, landscapes and challenges in each one. But in terms of sectors, the food distribution and the food need at the moment, I have to say the community have stepped up to the plate fantastically. But in terms of actual organisations going forward, I think those with, if you will, social enterprise or trading arms would be challenged most. We're in the midst of the tourist season, although the tourist season has probably been written off in the Western Isles, although we have a nominal date of the 15th. So in answer to your question, those with trading arms, whether it be in tourism, health and social care, we have to remember that the pressures on the third sector within health and social care delivery, that was there before COVID-19, so this is just exacerbated it, if you will.
Jeremy?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I just wondered if any of the other two wanted to comment.
Yes.
Maddie.
On you go, Maddie.
Yeah. We're just undertaking a survey of the voluntary sector in North Lanarkshire, and we've only got interim results back. But from that, it sort of matches the national picture that's emerging from national surveys like Oscars, which is around a third of organisations are saying, we haven't done the analysis about size, but about a third of respondents so far are saying that they've got insufficient funds to get them until March next year for this financial. Organisations are in crisis, and about 50% say they've got uncertain income, and only a small percentage say that they're confident about their funding position till March 2021. So I think we're facing a challenge across the board, which seems to match other data. I think in terms of your specific question about what size, I do think that will vary, but I suspect that actually probably it might be some of the medium-sized organisations that might struggle, because small community groups are generally volunteer run, and as we know from Oscar data, most of those small groups have income of under 10,000 a year. As indicated by the resilience groups, small volunteer-led groups can often form and deliver work with volunteers and survive in quite difficult times. Larger organisations often have reserves, but it's a bit early to say.
Thank you. Leslie?
Yeah, to echo the other points that we made, obviously our trading organisations are the ones that we're most worried about, and in particular I would say childcare comes top of the list of organisations that we think are really going to struggle, largely because they're dependent on what happens with schools. A lot of them are based in schools, and also they have to maintain a ratio, which we know our experiences of the childcare for key workers. It has been a much more expensive service to deliver, with things like equipment requiring to be cleaned every hour. So that's a very much more expensive service. Our other organisations that are currently grant funded aren't quite sure what their future will hold. Grant funders have been incredibly flexible so far, but we are aware that there's just going to be so many demands on funding, both from the independent grant funders and also from local authorities, who are a key funder of our sector. So people are worried without quite knowing what the future holds.
Jeremy?
Thank you all. That's helpful. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen over the next few months, and even into the beginning of. If we had another outbreak, and we went back to a kind of similar situation, what would you want done differently than what was done back in April? You know, hindsight's a great thing, but forgetting hindsight, what are the major lessons in regard to how we get the money to the charities in a most efficient way? What would we do differently if it happened again?
Are you asking anyone, Jeremy?
Yeah, put out to anyone. Yeah. And maybe start with you, Maddie, and then Hector, then Leslie, and then back to me, Duncan, you know.
Well, I have a very strong view that third sector interfaces, which know their local communities and voluntary sector well, should be centrally involved in designing any future fund, and where they're able, distributing it, because I think then you can take a sort of strategic approach rather than an ad hoc approach based on applications, because national bodies and funders don't know the local landscape. They can only evaluate each application on its merits. Whereas when you know the local area, you can actually look at whether there's different groups in that area providing the same service that could collaborate together, and you can do some behind the scenes convening. You can make some painful maybe decisions about which group is more effective on the ground. So I personally think that it would be very good to involve a sort of local strategic approach to investing in the resilience of the voluntary sector, in mind that most voluntary and community organisations are local.
Okay. Hector?
Yeah, thank you. I should probably start by saying, from a Western Isles perspective, we may be in the fortunate position that we haven't really come up against the first wave as yet. We've only had 8 cases to date and no deaths, thankfully. But obviously, we're moving into a different phase. We may be in a different, we're obviously in a different phase from the rest of Scotland, but the island communities are maybe in a different place at the moment. We are opening up, obviously, the islands to transport and tourism in the middle of July. And in conversations with local public health officials, we may be end of July into August, maybe when we may become challenged first. And at this time, at that time, we will be challenged at that point. But in terms of your question, I think we've had good experience in the last few weeks during the pandemic period in partnership working with local agencies. What I mean by local government health board, we sit on various resilience groups, and we have found that the input has been sought of the third sector and has been appreciated, for which we're very pleased to be involved, and we've had good feedback as to our involvement. We should say that also in the Western Isles, it is very rural. We're not alone in that, but we have several island groups, and the benefit we feel as a partnership, TSI, we have 6 partners across the islands, is that we can actually get into the community. We are part of the community on a very local basis, and we found that to be a benefit. And it's a benefit that the agencies and the resilience groups have sought out. So it will be a case of continuing that going forward, whatever we have ahead of us after July and August.
Thank you. Leslie?
I'd just like to reassure the panel that one of the things that we are planning for is that there might be a return to lockdown. We've produced a scenario planning pack for third sector organisations to work through to identify what resources they're going to need at each of the phases, and it does stress that we could go back a phase as well as going forward. I think, as mentioned earlier, if we did go back to one of the earlier phases and there was a need for additional funding, if it was one consolidated fund that we applied for. But the other thing that I would stress that is if we do go back to a lockdown situation, we're already identified a huge increase in issues about mental health and the strains that people are under. And I think that if people have come out of lockdown and then have to go back into it, we'll see another spike in mental health issues, which we're a bit better prepared for because there has been some investment in that over the past few months. But I really think it will put a big strain on organisations.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Andy?
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Welcome, witnesses. The Third Sector Interface Scotland published a national survey yesterday of findings of 1,171 respondents in relationship to the situation they currently find themselves in. I'm not sure if you've all read that report. I understand that there's going to be local versions of that produced in due course. I'd be keen to know when that is. And if you have read some of the headline figures, what is there anything that surprises you? And maybe start with Leslie, then Maddie, then Hector.
No, I think that this reflected what we were finding out on the ground about social enterprises definitely having been the worst hit and having been the most likely to furlough staff. That is very much what we are seeing as well on the ground. So I think it did pretty much reflect what we expected to see.
Maddie?
Yes, hi there. Well, I haven't actually had time to read the survey because I've joined this panel today while I'm on annual leave, but I'll be reading it on Monday. But just to say that in addition to that national survey, which we did distribute in North Lanarkshire, we're also doing, as I mentioned earlier, our local survey to supplement that data. What we find with online surveys is the smaller groups generally, as you might expect, they're volunteer-led. They don't respond in the same way as organisations with staff. So what we're investing in is we've got an online survey for North Lanarkshire, but we're actually utilising staff and volunteers to phone round and get that data, so we get a much higher level of response. So it will complement the national data.
Hector?
Yeah, again, I mean, the contents of the survey, they're not really a surprise. We also in the Western Isles are carrying out, we're in the midst of a survey just now, but initial findings, they very much agree with the what's been found nationally, particularly as Maddie just said, to do with social enterprises. So, yeah, no surprises in there.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask you about the medium to longer term. Obviously, many of the organisations you work with are volunteer-led, and I suppose volunteers is the one resource we have that can grow. And will be there and is not affected directly. We still have people. Are you finding an increase in volunteering? And what are the key issues you think we need to look at in terms of the longer term resilience of local third sector networks? I'll maybe just come to Leslie, Maddie and Hector, the same order.
Okay, I'll take volunteers first and then what we need next. Yes, volunteers is a very interesting question. As you're aware, we were given a large number of Ready Scotland volunteers. And to be honest, there is very little for them to do. Our community councils and other frontline organisations have been fantastic and already had a large number of volunteers on the ground. And our existing voluntary organisations who used volunteers have begun a process of getting them to translated into doing digital stuff, either phoning people or doing online stuff with existing clients. And that is working surprisingly well, certainly with adults and with young people. With children, it's much more difficult to offer online support. And certainly we're looking at organisations starting to think about maybe they can do activities outdoors as being slightly less risky. But volunteers, I agree, we absolutely have to harness all these people who offered their time and we weren't able to take that up. I can't think of anything worse than offering your time and somebody saying, well, actually, we don't need it at the moment. We do need it, we're going to need it in the future, and we have to come up with ways of involving people, and we're working very hard on that across the sector. In terms of what we need in the future, Foundation Scotland, one of the other funders, recently published an evaluation of its 3R funding, which also was around resilience, and made recommendations for the future. And I think they were absolutely spot on in terms of what they thought we needed, which was that we need core funding and capacity building for organisations. We need to tackle poverty and inequality, which has obviously risen as a result of this. We need to support projects around mental health, which we all reporting has been a huge issue for us. We need to support organisations to adjust to a new normal. It's not as simple as recovery, it's renewal. We're not going back to what we were, we're going into a new model, and we don't 100% know what that is. And we need to collaborate more than ever before. And if I could add one more thing to that, I think we need to harness the things that have worked really well. For example, just about the entire population has gone away and upskilled itself on using things like Zoom and House Party, and the tolerance for communicating over the internet now. That if I'd said, 6 months ago to a volunteer, well, rather than you trekking all the way down to the office, why don't we do a face-to-face WhatsApp call? And people will be much more receptive to that, which is good for them, it saves them time, and it's also good for the environment because they're not getting in their car and driving down to see me. So yeah, those would be my wishes.
Thank you, that's very useful. You mentioned a report there. I'm not sure if we have seen that. If you could maybe just send details to the clerk and the committee, that'd be very useful.
Will do.
Maddie?
In terms of volunteers and numbers and capacity, it's an interesting picture. Sadly, the Ready Scotland campaign was launched without local consultation with first sector interfaces that coordinate and support volunteers. So we actually ended up with, Leslie said, almost an excess of volunteers who wanted to help. We actually, for the first 3 months, couldn't place them. We are now beginning to place some of those volunteers, and that's been, we've kept in touch with them. A lot of those volunteers, I suspect, will also be people who are on furlough, who may therefore not be available moving forward. I think the picture around volunteering is very mixed. So you had a lot of local, spontaneous, informal volunteering, what I call neighbourliness. We really want to encourage that. And they didn't necessarily go through formal channels to register to volunteer. They often spontaneously volunteered in a local group. And I think that's wonderful, wonderful testimony to what people want to do. So somehow we need to encourage that. And also we need to support the formal volunteering moving forward. And I think there's a number of things there. One is the trend around volunteering is that older adults are actually volunteering less, which seems counterintuitive because they've got more time theoretically if they're retired. But I think the combination of maybe additional caring responsibilities for grandchildren, maybe older retirement age and so on. So we need to do something very, very active as we are locally, but maybe something nationally as well around older adults. Interestingly, the trend is that younger people are volunteering a lot more, and that's very welcome. And still adults of working age are volunteering, parent councils, children's groups, youth groups, and so on. So I think there's a piece of work there around intergenerational volunteering and older adults. And finally, 2 other points. One is that volunteering itself, the neighbourliness is free, but if you're wanting to support volunteers within a voluntary organisation, you do need some resources. You need some staffing time to coordinate, train and support them. Thank you. And you need travel costs normally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any brief comments, Hector?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean, my colleagues have obviously touched on the main ones there. I mean, the Ready Scotland campaign at the start, in some ways, I don't know if it caused a bit of confusion because in our area, Western Isles, the local authority had already started their own volunteer bank, if you will, whereby organisations and individuals could register their volunteering intent and also requirement for volunteers. But our experience in the Western Isles, I believe we have the highest population percentage per population of volunteers, which we're obviously very grateful for. What we found is that the volunteer organisations mobilised very quickly, almost before anybody else. They just sprung up. And what we also found was that as people came forward, the volunteer organisations were very grateful, but they seemed to have enough volunteers, certainly in the initial phase, to carry out the activities, which again just underlines the level of volunteering where we are. But as we move forward, we've been very aware and we're focused on volunteer fatigue, which we're into the third, fourth month now. We ourselves have our own befriending, social isolation activities, so we're very keen to keep an eye on volunteers. So lots of volunteers initially, lots of people coming forward, but again the important point is the importance of capturing and retaining younger volunteers just to maintain the supply of volunteers going forward.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Andy. Annabelle?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel. Yeah, on the issue of volunteering, I take I think Maddie's point about this, what she termed spontaneous volunteering, which certainly in my constituency of Cowdenbeath we saw emergency response groups, for example, set up in Benarty and Lochgelly, and then existing third sector organisations stepped up to the plate in terms of particularly focused on food and the supply of hot food. Reed Calfee and Kelty, for example, Eats Recite project. So there was a whole mixture of response, including the activities of many countless individuals. I'm very, very pleased indeed to hear that the Ready Scotland data bank, if you like, of surplus volunteers at this particular moment in time is not going to be lost, because, as has been said, if you offer to volunteer, the last thing that needs to happen is that offer is not at some point taken up and mobilised. So I think that's a very important point made also today. Returning to the Third Sector Resilience Fund, I just wonder if any particular organisation was not successful vis-a-vis that fund, are the panel members aware of to what extent they may have then been successful in applying to the Wellbeing Fund or the Supporting Communities Fund? It's just, it seems a bit of data that we don't have with regard to that.
Who to?
Maddie, start? Yeah, just go ahead. And then
well, there is analysis of all the different funds. I've looked at each individual fund separately, but I'm not aware if there's been cross-analysis about whether an organisation rejected from one was successful in another, but also they may have had to apply for something different because the criteria are different. And also, of course, in addition to the Scottish Government funds, there's independent funders as well that have been in the mix. So it's quite a complicated picture. We're asking locally about who's received funding from what organisation for COVID-19, but it'd be very difficult to say that X organisation rejected from the Resilience Fund definitely got funding from elsewhere. And just to emphasise, because the criteria were very different about the purpose of each of those funds as well.
Thanks. It's just really to see what any particular gap was. Leslie, and then Hector, do you have any further comment?
We were only aware of two organisations that came back really struggling to fit into any of the funding, and that was two of our childcare organisations that just seemed to be falling between the gaps, either because of what they were or what they were asking for. I think it's important to remember as well that organisations were making some very difficult decisions right at the beginning of this, basically around whether they were going to furlough staff or whether they were going to try and pursue funding to keep trading. So there are probably people who did opt to furlough staff, and it wouldn't have been their first choice. They would rather have had an input of money to keep going. And we also know from the responses that were put in by TSIs that there were smaller organisations that were put off from applying. as they might well be by any kind of formal sort of big application process.
Hector?
Yeah, can only agree with that. I mean, as has been said, the criteria for the various funds are entirely different. The Resilience Fund was probably for larger organisations, but I am aware that larger organisations who were both successful and unsuccessful in the Resilience Fund did go on to the Future Wellbeing Funds for individual projects relating directly to COVID-19. Now, obviously, that was a decision for them based on their cash flow, for want of a better word, and the use of reserves. But I am aware that some organisations did that because they obviously felt they had the resilience, even without funding, to carry out the individual COVID-19 projects. So yes, is my answer to that.
Thank you for that. Second question. Thank you. Just looking at the future, we had heard in the first panel and in the joint submission from the SCBO and the 3 co-managers of the Third Sector Resilience Fund that any additional funding coming to help with recovery should also be having a look at new service design and delivery, taking into account all the good things in terms of response that we've seen over the last months and the greater flexibility with decision making, focus on delivery, less bureaucracy, cross-working on the part of a whole series of different groups, perhaps less duplication. For each panel in turn, Maddie, Leslie and Hector in the same order, a couple of things. What would you like to see in this new service design and delivery? What would be your 2 key asks? Just because of time constraints today. Thank you.
2 key asks. Sorry, could you just clarify, when you say new service design and delivery, do you mean at local level how voluntary organisations work together, or were you meaning the design funding pot? Sorry, I wasn't clear.
With respect to this panel, absolutely. How locally on the ground you would interpret that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, what we're doing in North Lanarkshire is actually we're looking at recovery alongside a discussion about strategic investment that is trying to correlate what local needs are for support with the existing capacity of the voluntary sector to meet that need, and also to focus on what we call anchor organisations, ones that are actually critical. Now, that could be quite a painful journey because it might mean we have to make some tough decisions at local level about the organisations that we prioritise. But of course, that doesn't necessarily influence how they apply to national sources. So that's one of the other issues about national funding processes and local kind of strategic discussions about how we invest in our voluntary sector. And just to say that given most of the voluntary sector is very small and it's local groups with small pots of money with a number of local anchor organisations, it's not likely that mergers at local level are an issue. I would suggest this is a bigger issue for national level organisations, and some have merged and there's an ongoing discussion about it.
Thank you. Leslie?
I would say that this crisis really brought home to everybody the power of local. All the response in the first few weeks was a very, very local one, just by default. And as I mentioned earlier, that the geography of Midlothian means that transport is an issue for us. So we need to give serious consideration to things like, should we be encouraging volunteers to volunteer if it involves them getting on public transport, which still remains quite a risky activity. But on the other hand, if you can't use public transport, it's an equalities issue, because then the only people that can volunteer are people using cars. So I think an investment of money at a very local level to let us address these issues would be really welcomed. And I do think we have to harness the different way of working that the technology provides us with, and the fact that people are much more familiar with it now.
Great. Hector, briefly from you, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, I'd like to emphasise once more the local element of any service delivery going forward. I mean, consultation with agencies, with voluntary organisations, large and small, is key. If I can give a particular example in the Western Isles in the last few months, being community landlords who, obviously, after private buyouts of public land, I mean, they've been embedded in the community for a long time, and they also have come together and they've mainly acted as anchor organisations, pulling together the smaller organisations, third sector and others within their particular areas, and that can cover quite an area, large area across the Western Isles. So I would put that forward as an example going forward of joint working, partnership working, but keeping input into any service delivery on a local level. on all aspects, transport, whatever it may be.
Thank you. I think the consensus is focused on the local. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Graham.
Yeah, thanks, convener, and it's good to see the panel, and thanks for taking part. We've covered a lot of ground, so I just want to kind of mop up a few things that I've noted down. Firstly, if I could ask Maddie, I think you said earlier that in North Lanarkshire you need new volunteers. Did I hear you right there?
No, we've got plenty of volunteers registered from the Ready Scotland appeal, and prior to that, what I said earlier was that we initially couldn't place the newly registered ones from Ready Scotland, and we're starting to do that now into the sort of 4th month.
Okay, so there's enough volunteers, but you're just trying to find places for them. That's fine. I occasionally volunteer for the local Sustrans group. So that's the cycling charity, and we've basically been told not to do anything during lockdown. Has that been an issue for other local groups? Leslie?
Yes, I think funding is one way that the Scottish Government can help. The other way is by the provision of clear guidance about when things should and shouldn't happen. Adding on to the route map, because that's been an issue for us as well, that we had to make a lot of decisions on the ground about when volunteering was and isn't appropriate, and we're trying to do that against the route map, obviously, as things move on. We need to do individual risk assessments for each activity that takes place, with coronavirus kind of added on top of that. And I think each individual organisation has made that decision about volunteering, and I think it would have been good to see a bit of national guidance rather than all of us. I was going to say reinventing the wheel, that wasn't meant to be a pun, but about that. We've also been encouraging cycling. RUTS, the local project, has repaired 50 bikes to get people out and onto the cycle routes.
Maddie, what have you found in North Lanarkshire?
Well, yes, some activities were suspended because they couldn't be done remotely. They needed, so for example, some of the conservation charities going outdoors and doing allotment work or conservation and tree planting, you can imagine that sort of thing couldn't happen. But really, I've been very impressed with the adaptability of the voluntary sector and volunteers. So obviously, befriending has been done remotely, food support rather than cafes and lunch clubs, it's been delivered to home. So I think it's a mixture depending on the activities of whether it's gone ahead, adapted, or whether it's been postponed.
And Hector?
Yes, again, obviously a lot of activities have been curtailed, but in our own area, you mentioned cycling at the beginning. We've got our own project on cycling whereby we provide cycles to those in social isolation. Also, there's an element of cycling to work. So we were able to manage that safely with risk assessments, etc. So that continued. It was very popular, actually, because the roads, not that the roads are overly busy in the Western Isles anyway, but it seemed to be a bit safer for cyclists at that point. And another important one, befriending. That's we've got again our own befriending service, and that is it's gone up an awful lot. We're doing telephone befriending. We've actually had recruits from all over Scotland, obviously with island connections, but they have come forward to do telephone befriending, and it's been very, very well received. So, to answer your question, yes, some things have been restricted, but we have been able to deliver some activities.
Okay, and you'd agree that more guidance or clearer guidance is needed going forward?
Generally on all other activities, but we were able to manage on, as I said, on certain activities with internal risk assessments, yes.
Okay. Can I go back to the point that Maddie made earlier, and this is about the way that money is allocated? My first question, and if anyone knows the answer, just tell me, do you know who decides how the money is allocated? I see if someone stick that. Leslie.
Some funding that went out from the government was done on population basis, like the food money that went out connected to food. But I think these particular ones, they were just done, the first one, there was eligibility criteria to weed out people who shouldn't be applying to the fund. But then I think it was on the quality of your application, which obviously, as with all these things, benefits people who are good at writing applications, which is mainly bigger charities.
Do the bigger charities fared better because they're more used to making applications?
Yes, and it was more difficult for us to support the smaller ones because it was an online process. And I think one thing that I would recommend to any funder that's doing an online application is that you produce a PDF of what the questions are, so that you can the smaller organisations can talk through their answers to it before they have to sit down and input that.
Hector, anything on that one?
Yeah, in terms of who actually decides on where the money goes, I mean...
Yeah, and whether that should change.
Yeah, that obviously is dependent on the main funders. Our main involvement was through the Wellbeing Fund. The TSIs were involved in the earlier evaluation process, which I thought was a good example of joint working. And going back to the previous question about ways forward, I think it's something that would be welcomed by the TSIs and also the communities on a local level.
Right, Maddie, you had quite a bit to say earlier. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I feel very strongly about this because otherwise you've got structural inequality. Oscar's recognised that areas of greater deprivation actually have less charities, and therefore you can actually have a real problem. It's not just supporting local charities to apply. If you're wanting to build up local infrastructure to support need, you need that capacity building investment. So I think we need to look at it in a very different way. I think we need to look at it by area, have a formula, as we do to a degree for local government, based on population and deprivation and rurality. And I think that funds should be allocated in that way. And I would like to see a partnership between TSIs that have that intelligence and engagement working with the local authority, maybe partnering with a national funder that's got the infrastructure for funding management. Now, North Lanarkshire is a funding manager. We have a very big grant management programme, but not all TSIs do. So that kind of partnering might help us balance the issue around speed and process and assessment and getting money out with local intelligence. And the Wellbeing Fund was a pretty good example of that, but the other funds, that hasn't happened.
All right, last question from me, and that again, there's something that was raised earlier, and it was around digital exclusion. Do any of you have a sense of the scale of that? And we'll start with Leslie.
Connecting Scotland is trying to get tablets, devices, and Wi-Fi out to people that are excluded. And there's been an allocation for each local authority area, and we in Midlothian are getting 120. And I phoned Vocal, who are our local carers organisation, and said, there's 120. If you were bidding, how many would you go for? And they said, we could take all of those off your hands just to support the people that we're working with, the carers and the people that they're caring for, to enable them to get access. It's never been more important to be online. If you look at things like the GPs, appointment systems and GP consultations over the internet, we have a huge upskilling job to do around people who are not used to this, and it's much more complicated trying to do it online. Trying to teach somebody to use a computer over a computer is very difficult.
Okay, Maddie, you talked about this earlier, so I'll just go to Hector.
Yeah, we're obviously aware of the Connecting Scotland offer, but it's even less in terms of number of machines in the Western Isles. But I can say that through the Wellbeing Fund and other applications, grants were awarded for IT. But from a Western Isles perspective, one of the biggest challenges is actual broadband connectivity and just general connectivity. I have colleagues who are working from home just down in lovely places in Uig, in Lewis and Harris, who simply cannot get the connectivity they need to attend this type of meeting, for example. But that's an ongoing challenge, but in terms of what's happening at the moment, absolutely, connectivity is key. In the TSI, as part of representations, we were very keen on, when we're getting information out in the early stages on good practice and Scottish Government guidelines, that we couldn't depend just on online sources. There were a lot of our population who just don't have the access, and we got additional funding partnered funding to do simple things like leaflet drops, because a lot of our community just weren't being reached by the online facilities. So big gaps yet, but we are moving forward, and that needs to continue, COVID or no COVID.
Okay, thanks, convener.
Okay. Thank you very much, Graham. And finally, Kenneth.
Thank you very much, convener, and good morning, panel. Of course, when you're asked, much of what you want to ask has always been stolen by your colleagues. But I do want to follow on from what Graham has said, because I think what Maddie raised and which others have commented on is really fundamental. When we think about how local government funds are distributed, we have a funding formula which takes into account rurality, deprivation, etc. But we don't have that with the voluntary sector. However, do we have any consensus within the sector that this is a step we need to move forward to? Because obviously there'll be some areas of Scotland which will do relatively well at the current situation, and they might not be so keen to change unless the pot is expanded considerably.
Of course. Yeah. How do you want people to come in?
Maddie?
Yeah. Yes, of course, that is a challenge, that if the pot remains the same and you reallocate based on deprivation, population and rurality, some will get less, but I would say that that is then equitable. It may be insufficient, but it's equitable. And what I believe we have now is quite fundamental structural inequality. And I think it's a human rights and equalities issue. Obviously, I would much prefer to see the pot grow, so that the equitable distribution doesn't disadvantage those who've currently got disproportionately more. But I think this principle really does need to be argued for very robustly. And there was a review, for example, of TSI funding by the Third Sector Unit with a report to the Communities Minister suggesting a formula such as that, but the status quo was retained, which does disadvantage more deprived and rural areas with the current allocation. So yeah, a challenge, but I think one that we need to address.
Okay, does anyone else want to come in on that? Or are you happy to agree, Leslie?
I would say altering any funding formula is always very, very difficult, and people will be resistant to it. It's always nuanced about where organisations are based and where their beneficiaries are. And I would say that most funders have gone down the route, and I think it was referred to earlier, of trying to identify cold spots to try and make sure that there are areas that don't miss out because they don't have the capacity in their organisations, and funders have been quite good at putting additional funding in to try and address that.
Okay, Hector, do you get anything you want to say on this?
Yeah, please. I think it's fair to say that within even our own TSI network there have been differences of opinion. We're working with a historic formula. I honestly could put my hand up and say how the numbers were drawn up initially, but the Third Sector Unit, they touched on it last year, and I would like to think they'll return to it during this year. But I think it needs fundamental reform on the actual numbers, but it needs consultation with the TSIs as well.
I mean, just to follow on from this, a number of national organisations, obviously, in the third sector now, and local governments are allocated their budgets, but if you were to do something like this with regard to the third sector, you'd still have overreaching national organisations. It still might be more likely to spend money in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and the obvious kind of locations, particularly while community capacity in some deprived areas, including my own constituency and others, is an issue. So how do we address that particular issue? And also on this particular one, is there a real consensus within the third sector that we need to actually move towards, as Mary said, tackling structural inequality in terms of funding? Or is that an issue which has not yet raised its ugly head, so to speak? Who wants to go first? I think we'll do it in reverse order this time, actually. Would that be all right? You want to go first, Hector?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The last word,
yeah, I think we have to agree and concede that there is structural inequality within the third sector, and the funding of it certainly. What has caused a lot of discussion is the role of the nationals, so to speak, and it might be a case of they who shout loudest, etc., in terms of funding, but we keep touching on it in terms of TSI and the network, the need for locality. We just feel sometimes the nationals don't have that local connection for the groups and the individuals, and certainly the activities. So while we work very well with the nationals, SCVO, and social endpoint networks, etc., we just feel that the nationals need to take a more local view on some of the activities.
Okay, thanks. Leslie?
There's definitely not consensus on the issue, and I think it's going to be a very difficult issue to get consensus on. So I can only really speak for the Midlothian point of view. And we are the most rapidly growing local authority in Scotland. And I would say even the COSLA figures that are used for distribution of funding are historic data. They're based on out-of-date population figures. So if there was going to be a re-looking at where funding went from the Scottish Government across the board, I think we would be very happy about that in Midlothian.
Maddie?
You mentioned community capacity building. I mean, I'm very passionate about local bottom-up responses to local need. That doesn't mean there isn't a place for nationals, but many of the nationals have evolved over a long time, decades, and in some cases a century or more. So a TSI is funded to support that local community capacity building that involves local anchor organisations, small community groups, small enterprises, and also, if they need it, the supporting nationals that are delivering locally. So for me, I think it's about investing in that community capacity building with a focus on local is what we need to do. And that could go some way to tackling the structural inequality, but we do also need to look at funding formula. You can understand why nationals, of course, organisations have their own purpose, their own organisational drive, and I don't think that people would disagree in principle with the aspiration to tackle structural inequality. It's just that organisations play a different role and have a different relationship to local level work, and so are not probably advocating for it in the same way as we are locally.
Okay, thanks. And just a final question on a positive note. Obviously, this has been a very challenging time for the third sector, and fundraising is at the core of what you all do. I'm just wondering if there have been any innovative fundraising ways that have actually emerged that the panellists are aware of that they could perhaps share, not just with the committee, but also further afield within the third sector. So that, is there anything completely new or exciting, innovative about in terms of fundraising that's happened, or has it all been what we had before, but only less of it? Don't know. You're looking kind of quizzical. Leslie, do you want to kick off on that?
I was looking thoughtful. I'm not sure I can think of anything off the top of my head. It's, I mean, there's huge amounts of innovation in the sector in terms of service delivery at the moment.
Yeah.
We will see innovation, and I think we will definitely see a lot more partnership working, and that's certainly something that we're keen to look at, kind of consortiums, particularly as our organisations are smaller, consortiums that can go ahead in terms of procurement and work together to do things like that. So I think we will see that innovation developing over the next few months.
Okay, Maddie?
Nothing absolutely new and innovative, because the voluntary sector has been very adept at fundraising over. Locally, I've been very impressed at how quickly COVID-19 resilience groups have set up fundraising pages locally where they've got cash donations of food and other essential supplies from local people and actually from businesses. So although that of itself isn't new in that people have done that type of fundraising before, I've been really impressed with the speed at which they've been able to pull money and resources in from local communities. And I think that's testimony to people's local commitment. One other point is that we've had active approaches as well from corporate foundations who've wanted to invest directly in local areas and wanted to go through us as PSI. And again, that isn't a new thing in that corporate foundations donate money all the time, but their response of wanting again to work with us collaboratively to get that money out to local communities in areas of greatest need has been very welcome.
Okay, thank you. And Hector, have you been developing new connections in the Western Isles as well with organisations that perhaps weren't involved with the third sector before in terms of fundraising or even a new service development? Sorry.
Yeah, in terms of new activities, fundraising, I mean, there's probably no new activities other than they are perhaps virtual or online now, whether it be running or cycling, etc. But in terms of new partnerships, yeah, what we've seen across the islands is more partnership working in terms of, I think there's a question earlier on about organisations maybe coming together, possibly merging, but we have seen organisations on a local level coming together, looking at the resources, not just now, but going forward, where they could share resources to share costs, etc., etc. So there's definitely more thinking as to how to make the resources go further as a result of this past period.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much to the panel. That completes our questions and concludes our evidence session with our second panel. That's very useful. All I would ask you to do now is to hang up your phone. Thank you very much. That concludes the public part of this meeting, and I propose we take a 5-minute break. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for that discussion, which you are about to be sent. You can exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. Speak to you shortly.